Some people make it their life's journey to uncover conspiracies and connect every little event to every other event. And in times like this, it is very easy to make up whatever connections between different elites and events one could ever want. To analyze finance and the pretty direct connection between diminishing returns and global elites cooking up crackpot delusional plans to take over the world means people like me do not fall very far from the tree of conspiracy. However, I do not look at it through the lens of an elaborate evil satanic Kabbalah who's hellbent on taking over the world. Far from it. The financial forces behind politics and certain events are nothing more than reacting in simple survival for their shareholders. It always comes down to the chicken or the egg problem, time and time again. Rather than the failed conspiracy theorist to create conducive connections that at least describe everything having one main idea behind it, they're really talented at pointing out little itty-bitty things and trying to draw a conclusion from the little details. That isn't how any science-minded person thinks, however. Maybe philosophy-minded types, who don't really worry about where it all goes as long as they look smart pointing out interesting factoids. That brings us to the actual controllers of much of the world's capital. To people like Pidgeon Speaks, who was recently on Ed Dutton's stream. He smokes every cigarette from the Kabbalah conspiracy pack, and while I completely agree that there are forces trying to push for certain nefarious conclusions, Ed Dutton is more salient in pointing out how cyclical this is in human history. We are bound to repeating the same mistakes. That's why it is unhelpful to see the moneylenders as nefarious and evil, when really they're just trying to think ahead of the game, but always being stuck in their own survivalistic knee-jerk reactions. One of the biggest examples that I saw Black Pigeon use was how Blackrock is buying up single-family middle-class homes. I'm not sure if he elaborated on the point, but what everyone inevitably comes to is that there is some giant conspiracy for Blackrock to turn America into a nation of renters, rather than seeing the obvious reasons for their motives, which is to get ahead of the possible secular inflationary event that could last a decade or more, if you're going off the idea that we are in a 1970s-esque inflation event, which we aren't. Obviously, they don't really bank on it happening, but in being an extremely efficient mega-giant holdings company, they have to make sure they are allocated to whatever crazy stuff could happen in these unpredictable times. To conspiracy-minded types, they can't just see people renting as to make a better financial option for themselves in unpredictable times. No. There has to be some interconnected, elaborate reason for it happening. It just so happens it's always the uneducated and willfully ignorant who believe these conspiracy theories. For the not well-read types, however, they do not see events being orchestrated in reaction to something out of the orchestrator's hands. They simply see a shady, bespoken cabal that wants to Machiavellianly create a dystopian future, rather than simply preparing. It goes back to the chicken or the egg. Blackrock isn't trying to orchestrate a giant conspiracy, but rather are making cogent approaches to an increasingly unpredictable economy that isn't exactly doing well. In buying real estate, they are simply doing what people have done in the past when potential inflationary events come about. I'm sorry, but for any of y'all who think that there is a giant plan, there just isn't. All the world's biggest and smallest players are simply trying to get ahead of different events, and ones who do really well at it tend to grow really big and might have better deals, but ultimately, the great inflation of the 1970s was out of the control of the market and its biggest players, as was the Great Depression, and the era of post-2008 low-growth and no-growth recession that we are stuck in. What's ironic is the Fed and friends really enjoy when morons who know very little about how the banking system actually works try to perpetuate this idea that the Fed is competent enough to pull the levers and produce inflation, when they have never and will never do any such thing. Though, this is just a sign of the times. When people have absolutely no faith left in the moneylender, you know we are about to be on a rough ride when the financier class, who are simply acting out of survival, don't forget, we are all dependent on them and their high IQ banksters to keep the scam economy rolling, are blamed for every bit of the debt-laden lower and middle classes' folly. Sure, The banksters made the mortgage-backed securities, but the poor saps took on the debt in the first place, and it's no one else's fault except themselves. A trend throughout history is coercion on the part of those who have power, and being incoercible is the first step towards what true freedom is attainable. Unfortunately, it's just too easy to blame the highest-up manager with the least responsibility and rinse and repeat. So when the next market crash happens, the record amount of margin calls are made, those who are debtors get called on to pay up as much on their principal as possible, there will be horns sounding from politicians and pundits, blaming every financier on Wall Street, every gosh darn greedy fund manager, every holdings company manager, to absolve any blame. There shouldn't be any blame for a system in collapse, though, but that's just how we do things as a species. Insecurity about one's own culpability for the collapse of the financial system will really drive people mad. That's why when Blackrock is blamed for simply making an effort to honor their promises to their shareholders, the average American who is too insecure about their own abilities to balance their own checkbook will be kicking and whooping as their Mercedes and house is stripped from them. In the meantime, before any of that is near to happening, people will keep shoving responsibility for modern moral and societal ails onto other groups, especially powerful ones, because it gives them just a little extra time to be lazy and unhelpful to improving the world around them. It's easier to complain and blame BlackRock for housing price spikes than simply recognizing them hopping on a bandwagon before it is too late. Chicken or the egg? It is easier to foist the issue of high consumer debt onto coercive fat cats than to just blame the typical Joe Blow on the street who got a mortgage and card note in a trembling economy where he has hardly any upward mobility in his job. The difference is BlackRock can probably take a bit of a bigger hit than the average American. But isn't that how it always goes? It's the people holding the bag who are stuck with the consequences. How is that not fair? A quote: "There is nothing new on Wall Street. There can't be, because speculation is as old as the hills. Whatever happens in the stock market today has happened before and will happen again." Jesse Lauriston Livermore. Thank you and God bless.